It was supposed to be an art of permanence, a mark of love, rebellion, or memory etched into skin with the promise of forever. In the city's most trusted studio, Eternal Ink., clients came in steady streams, soldiers before deployment, lovers sealing vows, teenagers chasing identity. At the center of it all stood Adrian Cole, the tattooist with the steady hand and the gentle voice, praised for turning pain into beauty. But behind his calm smile was a fracture no one saw. Years of whispers about his divorce, the debt collector's calls, the humiliation of being replaced by younger artists. And in that silence, he began to rewrite what ink meant. One evening, as needles hummed and bottles of pigment glistened under neon light, Adrian set his plan in motion. The ink, once a vessel of stories, had been laced with a substance invisible, odorless, and merciless. Days later, as clients proudly displayed their fresh tattoos, they began to falter. First one collapsed in a dormitory hallway, another gasped for air in a supermarket line, then another was found motionless in his car. By the time doctors traced the common thread, bodies were piling, and Eternal Ink was no longer a sanctuary of art. It was a crime scene. This is the story of the tattooist who turned a canvas of life into a gallery of death. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Under the pale lights of the Civic Hall, the air was heavy with incense and disinfectant, a mixture that clung to the back of the throat like ash. Rows of coffins stretched in silence, each one draped not in flags but in cloths embroidered with flowers and geometric patterns, as if to soften what could not be softened. Inside them lay bodies too young for such ceremonies, their arms folded, their skin still showing the sheen of fresh ink. The tattoos glistened faintly under the fluorescence, black lines and colored strokes that had not yet healed, trapped forever in the purpling of cooling flesh. Families pressed close to the polished wood, whispers breaking into sobs, the sound of knuckles striking against wood like muted drums. It was 9 a.m., and the hall was already filled with mourners who carried their grief like a weight strapped to their backs. Mothers clutched framed photographs. Fathers stared at the floor as if unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The silence fractured now and then by a cough, a suppressed wail, or the shuffle of chairs. Yet the deeper sound was something unspoken, disbelief. No one wanted to admit what bound these deaths together, but the proof was drawn into the skin of every coffin that passed. A young man in his 20s lay with his sleeve rolled up, the inked outline of a compass across his forearm gleaming faintly as if wet. The lines were crisp, too new, the redness around the edges still raw. Another coffin revealed a girl, barely 18, with petals tattooed across her collarbone, the colors vivid against pale flesh. A mother leaned over her, whispering words that dissolved into sobs. She only wanted something beautiful. The words fell, but no one replied. At the back of the hall, the sound of a microphone crackled as a minister cleared his throat, yet his voice faltered before it could rise. Instead, the hum of fluorescent lights filled the space, steady and merciless. Cameras clicked in the corner where journalists tried to capture the collective collapse of a community, their lenses lingering on the details. The shimmer of ink against cold skin, the trembling hands that traced it. Time inched forward like molasses. At 9:15 a.m., pallbearers shifted another coffin into place, their gloves brushing against the polished handles. Something metallic clattered then, sharp and unexpected. A needle had slipped from a wreath, or so it seemed at first, tumbling onto the stone floor. Yet the sound it made was too precise, too surgical, echoing like a syringe hitting tile in an operating room. Heads turned. The hall froze. The tiny piece of steel lay there, gleaming under the lights, the air suddenly tighter as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Whispers began to thicken among the pews, all young, all recent, all had tattoos. No one spoke it fully, but eyes turned toward the visible markings on the bodies. The ink, once admired as art, now seemed to glow with accusation. A woman clutched her son's wrist and pulled down the cuff of his sleeve, as if hiding the black letters freshly inscribed there could erase them from fate. At 9:32 a.m., a mother near the front broke. Her hand trembled as she reached toward the glass of her daughter's coffin, fingertips smudging against it, her voice barely audible but cutting through the silence like a blade. All they had in common was the ink. The words lingered in the air, heavier than the incense, heavier than grief. Heads lowered, eyes closed, yet no one could unhear it. The ink that had once promised memory and permanence now carried another meaning, one unspoken but unmistakable. It lay in the still body stretched before them, in the needle glinting on the stone floor, in the silence that followed the mother's whisper. The camera lights flared once more, capturing the trembling moment, but the real record was carved into the minds of every mourner. What had been trusted had betrayed them, what had been celebrated had turned lethal. And as the clock ticked toward 9:45 a.m., the hall seemed to fold inward on that one terrible image, the ink that still gleamed, refusing to fade, even as the lives beneath it had already disappeared. But this was only the beginning. The city wore its youth like a badge, loud in its murals, restless in its music, eager to carve identity into skin and skyline alike. Neon signs buzzed late into the night, casting pink and violet across wet asphalt where motorcycles idled, and couples clung to one another as if time itself could be tattooed into permanence. For many, it could. Tattoos had become the city's second language, an alphabet written not on pages but on flesh, a private scripture carried into the grave. The most trusted sanctuary of that creed stood on a quiet street lit by a single red bulb, eternal ink. Its doorway was narrow, the kind you might miss if you were not looking, yet once inside, the air shifted. Walls lined with framed designs stretched like icons in a chapel, dragons and roses beside portraits of lost children, every image both prayer and declaration. The floor carried the faint hum of machines even when they rested, like a heartbeat refusing to die down. Eternal Ink was not just a studio. It was the altar where pain was traded for beauty, where needles wrote what words could not. On weekends, young men arrived in groups, their laughter spilling over each other as they debated designs. Lovers came hand in hand whispering choices as if secrets too fragile to survive outside the buzz of the machine. Soldiers stopped by before deployments, marking their skin with anchors, flags, or the names of towns they feared they might never return to. A mother once brought her daughter on her 18th birthday, saying only, "It lasts longer than a cake." The shop held all these stories, and people trusted it more than they trusted hospitals, more than they trusted priests. The heart of it all sat on a wooden shelf, rows of bottles filled with ink, their caps flecked with dried pigment. Black was the constant, the foundation of every design, the shade that gave weight to wings, to thorns, to names of the dead. When the light struck the bottles just so, the black ink looked less like pigment and more like coagulated blood, thick and absolute. Artists treated those bottles with reverence, shaking them slowly before pouring a few drops into small plastic cups, like pouring communion wine. Clients rarely looked at them. They looked instead at the stencil, the sketch, the dream of what their skin might become. The hum of the machine began at 10 a.m. most mornings, a sound that slipped into memory as much as into walls. First came the buzz, then the faint sting as the needle broke skin, and soon after the smell, a mixture of latex gloves, disinfectant spray, and faint metallic ink. Some described it as clinical, others as oddly comforting. For those who sat in the chair, time blurred. Hours dissolved under the rhythm of the needle, a metronome counting down toward permanence. Clients spoke in fragments, half distracted by pain, half liberated by it. Feels like flying, like burning, like it's supposed to. The artist rarely answered, but his silence was its own reply, steady and patient. The city held stories about tattoos too, shadows that clung to the art. A decade earlier, whispers had circulated about infections. 3 clients from another parlor fell sick, fevers climbing until their skin peeled around swollen outlines. Headlines flared for a week, tabloids screaming about killer ink. Yet investigations concluded it was poor sanitation, nothing more, and the panic ebbed. Eternal Ink had survived untouched, its reputation not only intact but burnished. Here, people said, was where tattoos were safe, clean, holy. The phrase lingered like gospel, holy ink. Those who mentioned the infections now did so as a joke, shaking their heads at how easily fear could spread. Remember that scare turned out to be nothing. The rumor became another tattoo itself, faded and dismissed. But the memory was never fully erased. Sometimes in the waiting area, when someone stared too long at the black bottles lined on the shelf, another would nudge them and murmur, "Don't worry." That was years ago. Laughter followed, brittle and quick, as if to push back unease. Yet the joke left an aftertaste. The bottles gleamed, dark as clotting veins, waiting for the next hand to lift them. At 7 p.m. on a Friday, the shop filled with sound. Music low, machines buzzing in unison, chatter rising as friends filmed one another with their phones. Eternal Ink thrived most at that hour, when the city seemed to lean into night and the last sunlight painted windows gold. In those moments, the shop was more than a business. It was a theater of identity. Clients bore the sting of needles like martyrs, and each drop of ink felt like proof against vanishing. No one questioned the ritual. No one doubted the tools. And so the city moved forward, oblivious to the shadow curling inside its own sanctuary. The bottles remained lined on the shelf, silent and gleaming, their liquid blackness promising transformation. Yet the old rumor still hovered like a ghost at the edge of every joke. Infections, they had once said. Death by ink. It had been dismissed, forgotten, ridiculed. But beneath the laughter and the buzzing machines, the possibility clung like residue, waiting to be rewritten. On a quiet night after the last client left and the machines went still, the bottles reflected the glow of a single lamp. They stood in rows, uniform and patient, their contents shifting like dark blood under glass. No one noticed how heavy they seemed, how absolute. They waited in silence, carrying more than color, carrying something unspoken. And in that stillness, the air felt as if it knew what no one yet dared to name. The first time he stirred the powder into liquid, it was almost clumsy. A single grain clung to the rim of the spoon, refusing to dissolve, catching the light as if it wanted to betray him. Adrian tapped the edge gently, then watched the crystal vanish into the swirl of black, leaving no trace but a faint shimmer that reminded him of blood thickening in water. He sat at the workbench with the blinds drawn tight, the lamp overhead throwing a pale circle across the bottles. The hum of the city at 11 p.m. was distant, muffled by the glass, while in his hands the silence carried the weight of invention. He wrote it down, not in plain words, never in full sentences, just ratios and initials, notes scratched between sketches of roses and wings. He titled the page with nothing more than a date and a mark, a private code. To anyone else it looked like practice stencils. To him it was a formula. Each time he refined the mixture, he adjusted the numbers. Half a milliliter less, a grain more, the ink turning darker, heavier, but unchanged in scent. He touched a drop to his fingertip, held it beneath his nose, searching for any difference. It smelled only of permanence, the same scent he had lived inside for decades. The symbolism sharpened in his mind until it became its own doctrine. Ink was blood. Skin was canvas. Death was the masterpiece. Every line drawn was no longer decoration but incision. Each tattoo would not only mark a story but conclude it. The thought settled into him with a calmness that frightened even himself. He began to treat the bottles with reverence, as though each one were an urn waiting to be filled. Rituals soon took shape. Before each appointment, Adrian opened a worn notebook with leather corners frayed by time. He wrote the client's name in careful script, followed by the design they had requested. And beside each he drew a symbol, an X, firm and red, crossing through their future. He said nothing to them, of course. To his clients he was still steady-handed Adrian, the artist who listened in silence. To himself he was writing an invisible obituary. At 2 p.m. one Thursday, a young man named Lewis came in for a phoenix on his chest. Adrian had written the name hours earlier, drawn the X beside it, mixed the ink. When Lewis arrived late and distracted, Adrian barely spoke, his hand steady in its tremor. The lines sank into flesh, black fire spreading across skin. When it was finished, Louis smiled into the mirror, his reflection beaming with what he believed was renewal. Adrian simply nodded. Later that evening, he returned to his notebook and drew another line across the X, sealing it as complete. There was one appointment that never came. A woman named Claire had booked a tattoo at 5 p.m. on a rainy Monday. Her name was already written, her X already drawn, the ink already stirred and waiting. At 4:45 p.m., Adrian received the call. She was canceling something about work, maybe rescheduling next month. His hand tightened around the phone, but his voice stayed calm. Of course. Another time. When he hung up, the silence felt unbearable. He looked at the page where Claire's name lay, the red mark slashing through it like prophecy. He considered erasing it, but the ink of the pen had already bled into the paper. He pressed harder with his pencil, dragging another scarlet line through her name until it cut the page nearly in half. The entry remained marked as if fate would not let her go, whether she knew it or not. Each preparation became more meticulous. Gloves snapped tighter, bottles aligned straighter, the spoon for mixing polished until it reflected his eye like a mirror. He worked with the precision of a chemist, pouring, swirling, testing, then hiding. In the back of the studio, a drawer became his reliquary. Inside, arranged with an order only he understood, sat the tools of his new devotion. Rows of black ink glistened faintly, lids sealed tight, every bottle indistinguishable from the next. And at the far edge, wrapped in paper like contraband, lay the powder in its small glass jar. White and silent, it waited, the ghost opposite of the ink's black. Sometimes, in the quiet hours past midnight, he would slide the drawer open and just look. The reflection of the lamp caught on the glass, throwing fractured sparks across the powder. It seemed to breathe, to whisper of all the names written in his notebook, all the X's drawn with such care. He placed his trembling hand on the counter and let it hover between bottle and jar, the ink and its twin, creation and erasure. His breath slowed. The line between them was vanishing. The hum of machines from the day lingered in the air like echoes of confession. Clients had laughed, winced, shared secrets while the needle sang across their flesh. Now silence pressed down, broken only by the faint rattle of powder shifting when the drawer closed. The room smelled still of antiseptic and ink, but beneath it in his imagination another scent stirred, something metallic, something final. In the notebook, Claire's name remained, the red X crossing her absence as if absence itself could not protect her. Adrian stared at it, the page trembling under his hand, until the sound of the rain outside began to feel like applause. His reflection in the window was nothing but shadow, the bottles glowing behind him. And when the drawer clicked shut at 12 a.m., the last image was stark and inescapable. The black ink gleaming like blood under glass, resting against the white powder that glowed faintly in its jar, the two halves of a ritual waiting to be completed. Louis's death slipped into the city's veins like a quiet injection, barely noticed beyond the circle of friends who carried him to the emergency doors at 12:46 a.m. He had been laughing only minutes before, telling a story about his new tattoo, a black phoenix that stretched across his chest in wings still scabbed and raw. Then the laughter had stopped, replaced by a sharp cough, a faltering step, and the sound of his body hitting the pavement. By the time he lay on the hospital gurney, fluorescent light bleaching the fire from his skin, his breath was a whisper drowning under the static of monitors. Nurses pressed oxygen masks against his face, doctors barked numbers, adrenaline syringes snapped between gloved fingers, but the tide pulled away from them relentlessly. At 1:12 a.m. the monitor went flat. The sound of loss was one long, unbroken tone. The chart recorded it neatly. Acute allergic reaction, as though grief could be cataloged like a rash. His parents repeated the phrase to relatives in hushed voices, trying to believe it. No one mentioned the phoenix rising across his chest, the wings inked only a week earlier now glowing faintly beneath embalmer's light. 2 weeks later, the rhythm repeated itself with a different name, a different home, A different silence. Danielle was 27, mother of an infant not yet walking, wife of a man who would never again forget the sound of her collapse at 6:30 p.m. in their kitchen. She had been humming, balancing a bottle in one hand when her knees buckled. Her husband said it was as if her song had been cut mid-note. The ambulance carried her away in a flurry of blue lights, neighbors staring through windows as if trying to memorize tragedy. Inside the ER, machines crowded around her, wires tangled, defibrillator pads leaving marks on her ribs. At 7:04 p.m. the line steadied into silence. The report read idiopathic heart failure. Idiopathic meaning without cause, without anchor, without sense. Her last photo online showed her shoulder bare, a bouquet of roses unfurling across her skin, captioned "For my mother forever." At the funeral, the flowers wilted quickly in summer heat, their petals sagging as if bowing toward the tattoo hidden beneath her dress. Time did not pause. The city consumed both deaths the way it consumed traffic accidents or sudden strokes, filing them away into the cabinet of chance. Yet beneath the surface, the ink remained. In the third week, Tyler, a 19-year-old student, collapsed over his textbooks in the library at 3 p.m. His friends thought he was asleep, until his head rolled off his arm and thudded against the desk. His lips were blue by the time paramedics arrived, the word freedom still glistening across his wrist, the ointment on his skin shining under the sterile light like oil on water. They carried him past shelves of ancient volumes that had survived centuries, while his pulse vanished before he reached the ambulance. At 3:42 p.m. he was declared gone. Respiratory failure, the chart said, as though air itself had betrayed him. In the hospital cafeteria later that week, a nurse thumbed through 3 separate charts as she stirred her coffee. Lewis, 23, allergic reaction. Danielle, 27, idiopathic failure. Tyler, 19, respiratory collapse. The ink bled into each page, not in diagnosis but in the notes she scribbled for herself. Fresh chest tattoo, rose shoulder piece, wrist script. She stared at the words, her hand trembling, the letters darker with each stroke of the pen. She folded the page before anyone could see, slipping it into her pocket. Adrian kept working in eternal ink as though nothing shifted. The needle buzzed its steady hymn. Clients sat in his chair with excitement, telling him stories, trusting his hands. He nodded, hummed, rarely spoke. His notebook grew thicker, the red X's spreading across pages like silent gravestones. He polished the machine until it reflected his gaunt face, stirred ink until it was blacker than night, wiped the counters until no trace remained. To his clients, the ritual was professionalism. To him, it was liturgy. The weeks grew heavier. In a bar, someone mentioned Lewis. Heart just gave out. At a grocery line, Danielle's name surfaced. No family history, nothing, just gone. On campus, Tyler's desk remained untouched for days, a small shrine of pens and books. None of the voices mentioned ink. None connected skin to silence. But in the ER, one nurse began to connect. At 11 p.m., she sat in the break room, staring at her folded scrap of paper. She took it out, flattened it on the table, and wrote again in block letters, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore the page. 3 cases, all had fresh tattoos. She underlined it twice. The letters seemed to shout even in silence. She folded it back carefully, tucked it deep into her pocket, and whispered under her breath, "This isn't random." The night shift went on. Ambulances screamed through city streets, families wept in waiting rooms, charts filled with new diagnoses. Yet beneath the fluorescent hum, the note waited, a fragile thread linking deaths scattered by time. The community still celebrated tattoos as freedom, memory, art. Only one pair of eyes now saw them differently, as marks not of permanence but of doom. And somewhere behind the blinds of eternal ink, a drawer clicked shut on bottles that looked identical, though one carried permanence and the other carried silence. The ink gleamed faintly under the lamp, black as coagulated blood, waiting for another name, another X, another skin that believed it was receiving beauty but was instead receiving its end. By the time the third funeral ended, Whispers had swollen into something louder, a current moving through cafes, subway cars, and late-night hospital corridors. It was the morning broadcast that finally cracked the silence. At 8 a.m., the anchor's voice trembled between composure and disbelief as the words scrolled beneath her. Killer Inc. Cluster of deaths linked to tattoos. The camera cut from her face to a gloved hand holding up a small glass bottle, its cap sealed, the liquid inside darker than oil. The label was ordinary, the kind every tattooist stocked, but on screen it glistened like evidence of a crime. Viewers saw not ink but a black vial of contagion, a reservoir of betrayal. The Studio Eternal ink, once painted as a sanctuary of artistry, was now replayed in a loop on television as if it were an outbreak site. Footage of its neon sign flickering in the drizzle was paired with archival images of smiling clients, their tattoos still raw, their eyes shining with pride. The narration overlaid the footage like a sentence. Several recent deaths, each victim bearing a fresh piece from the same shop. The effect was surgical. What had been a temple of memory now looked like a chamber of contagion. Reporters clustered outside the shop, microphones stabbing toward any passerby who had ever sat in Adrian's chair. Did you notice anything strange? Was the ink different? Did he ever say something odd? Most shook their heads, some stammered, others repeated the line that had once been a badge of comfort. He was the best. Steady hands, gentle voice. Yet under the lights, their certainty cracked, replaced by the unease of being filmed saying the name of a man who was now framed as suspect. The panic widened. Mothers dragged their teenagers out of appointments, demanding refunds, ripping off bandages, scrubbing skin raw with alcohol as if ink could be washed away. College students canceled bookings. Tattoo parlors saw empty chairs where weeks before they had been packed. The object once seen as permanence became stigma. Even untouched bottles of ink were regarded like vials of plague. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, a different voice entered the noise. An investigative reporter aired a segment not about clients but about Adrian himself. Grainy shots of his workbench, filmed through the glass at night, showed papers spread under a lamp. One frame froze long enough for viewers to see the edge of a notebook, pages filled with sketches and cryptic markings. Shapes of daggers, birds, flowers, all drawn with a precision bordering on ritual, but beside them small red symbols repeated in margins. A cross, an X, a jagged slash. The reporter's voice dropped lower, carrying suggestion rather than accusation. Authorities are now examining whether these sketches might reveal a pattern of intent. The city absorbed the images like prophecy. The notebook was replayed in slow motion, screenshots circulating online, theories multiplying faster than facts. People wrote in comment threads, "Those are death marks. Look at the dates in the corner." He was keeping track. Whether true or not, the symbols became a new form of contagion, spreading suspicion that the deaths were not random at all but written into lines long before. Inside Eternal ink, Adrian continued his rituals. He scrubbed his hands methodically, sterilized machines, lined up bottles as though the outside world did not exist. Yet the silence inside the shop pressed differently now. The windows carried faint reflections of cameras. He adjusted the blinds lower, his face lit not by natural light but by the dim glow of his desk lamp. He opened the notebook again, drew a line through another name, the red slash cutting across paper like a wound. By the second week of coverage, authorities had stepped in. Public health officials appeared at a press conference, pale under the fluorescent glare, insisting there was no definitive link yet. But the crowd outside shouted louder. They held signs scrawled with slogans. "No more Killer Inc. Shut him down." The very people who once praised his artistry now pressed their bodies against barricades demanding his erasure. The everyday bottle of ink became the star of the broadcasts. Cameras lingered on close-ups of black liquid under forensic lights, the lens catching its surface like coagulated blood. Narrators compared it to contagion. Anchors lowered their voices when saying the word ink, as if pronunciation itself could spread danger. In newsrooms, an editor replayed a particular piece of footage 3 times before deciding to air it. The clip came from a security camera positioned across the street from Eternal Ink. The timestamp read 2 a.m. The footage showed Adrian alone, the shop bathed in pale green from a security lamp. He moved slowly, almost reverently, toward his workbench. He opened a drawer, removed a bottle, replaced it with another, his hands steady, deliberate. The camera zoomed in, catching his face tilted upward for a fraction of a second, the green light making his features ghost-like, hollowed. The voiceover whispered the words that sealed the effect. At 2 a.m., under the cold light of surveillance, the man once trusted with memory now appears to guard something else. The clip ended with him lowering the blinds, shutting out the view, but not before the frame caught the gleam of glass, a bottle placed down beside his hand, reflecting the green light like an eye. That was the last image on screen before the anchor's voice returned, low and unsettled. The words hung like a verdict. The pattern is no longer in question. The only question is how deep it runs. And in that silence, the city realized that trust had already curdled into suspicion, that the ink they once celebrated now stained more than skin. The camera froze on the image of Adrian's face half-lit in surveillance glow, the drawer still ajar, the bottle gleaming beside his hand, as if the darkness itself had finally been caught staring back. The lab report arrived on a gray morning at 9 a.m., a stack of papers that smelled faintly of solvent and ink. The conclusion was brief, clinical, and devastating. The black liquid from Eternal Ink was not just pigment. Threaded through the dense molecules was a compound that should never have been near human skin, a toxin disguised by the depth of its color. The ink itself had become the weapon. Scientists underlined the finding twice, their handwriting jagged as though hurried by disbelief. Detectives spread the bottles across a steel table under fluorescent light, the glass reflecting harshly. One leaned closer, whispering to himself, "It looks ordinary." Another replied, "So did the cupcakes in Fairview." The air in the room was taut, a mixture of chemical fumes and quiet rage. What once gave permanence to memories now held permanence of another kind, irreversible, cellular, final. They began to trace the chain. Old purchase orders, shipments of pigment, the notebooks taken from Adrian's desk. A former apprentice was called in, a young man who had left Eternal Ink years ago, still carrying faint outlines of practice tattoos along his own arms. His voice shook when he spoke. He always kept one bottle separate, he said. He called it his special ink, never let anyone else touch it, said it was for work that mattered. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, work that mattered. They asked him again, and the apprentice nodded, eyes darting toward the table. "It was always locked in the bottom drawer. I thought it was just pride or superstition." Investigators moved quickly. That same evening at 7 p.m., a team entered Eternal Ink with a warrant, the neon sign above the door flickering nervously in the rain. Adrian was inside, calm, arranging needles as though nothing outside existed. When the detective spread through the studio, opening drawers, lifting bottles, he did not shout or resist. Instead, he picked up a small case from the counter and said evenly, "This needs to be delivered to the lab for quality testing." He tried to walk past them, his movements steady, rehearsed, almost casual. One officer stepped in front, hand raised. "Put it down." Adrian's eyes flicked toward the cameras mounted near the ceiling, then back to the officer's face. He set the case down with deliberate slowness. Inside were several sealed vials, black liquid glistening under the fluorescent hum. His voice remained calm. "Samples, nothing more." They let him step aside, not wanting to spook him, but by the time the evidence team turned their attention back, he was already moving toward the rear door. "Where's he going?" one officer muttered, rushing after him. But outside, the alley was empty, wet pavement shining with rain and green light from a street lamp. Adrian had vanished into the city's veins. The search of the shop continued into the night. Behind the counter, in a wastebasket lined with paper towels, an officer's gloved hand paused. Pulled from the crumpled pile was a pair of latex gloves. They were streaked with black, but clinging to the smears was something finer, a white residue clumped in the creases. The gloves were sealed instantly, the officer muttering, "Not just ink." Under the magnifier, the black and white fused like marble veins, pigment and powder joined in unnatural union. It was proof not of coincidence, but of deliberate mingling. Detectives stared at the empty chair where Adrian had sat only minutes before, the armrest worn smooth by years of clients' hands gripping through pain. Now it looked like a throne abandoned, a stage missing its actor. On the desk, the notebook lay open to another page, fresh lines of names drawn through with red, the ink bleeding slightly as if written in haste. At midnight, the phone rang in the command center. A forensic voice, flat with exhaustion, carried the weight of confirmation. The toxin isn't isolated to a single bottle. It has contaminated the entire batch. Every vial in circulation is compromised. The room fell silent, the words settling like ash. Entire shipments scattered across clients and studios had become invisible veins of death. The last image of the night was not of Adrian himself, but of the evidence cart rolling past cameras. Bottles aligned in neat rows, their surfaces glistening under sterile light, each one indistinguishable from ordinary ink. Yet inside, the blackness carried a silent contagion, a betrayal sealed under screw caps. And somewhere beyond the rain-soaked streets, the man who mixed them walked free, his hands perhaps already reaching for another drawer, another bottle, another name to mark with red. Rain clung to the windows of Eternal Ink at 2 a.m., the neon sign above the doorway pulsing weakly like a heartbeat on the edge of collapse. Police vehicles lined the block, their red and blue strobes painting the brick walls in feverish colors. A perimeter had been set, radios crackled with clipped commands, and officers shifted nervously in the downpour. For hours, the city had waited, the streets empty but for the hum of engines and the whisper of anticipation. Inside, a single light burned in the back room, steady and unwavering. He was still there. When the door finally opened, Adrian stepped out slowly, his cardigan damp from the studio's humid air, his face shadowed under the fluorescent spill. He did not run, did not resist, did not even glance at the barricade forming around him. Instead, he raised his hands as if in a gesture of quiet benediction. His voice carried clearly despite the rain, calm and unhurried. "It's done." 2 words, the same that survivors would later say felt less like surrender than proclamation. The officers surged forward, handcuffs snapping around his wrists, cold metal against a pulse that did not quicken. The interrogation room smelled of bleach and old smoke. Adrian sat at the metal table, wrists chained lightly as though the gesture itself was symbolic. Across from him, detectives unfolded photographs of funerals, hospital corridors, vials of ink under harsh light. They expected protest, denial, perhaps even collapse under the weight of evidence. Instead, Adrian leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping an invisible rhythm against the steel, eyes following the pictures one by one as though they were pieces of a gallery curated for him alone. "You call them victims," he said finally, his tone almost conversational. "I call them signatures. Every tattoo was a death sentence signed in ink. They asked me for permanence. I gave it to them." The detectives exchanged glances, pens halting mid-note. Adrian's words fell heavy, a manifesto delivered without heat, his calm more unnerving than rage. One officer snapped, voice rising above the hum of the fluorescent lamp. "You poisoned people who trusted you, families, kids." Adrian's gaze flicked toward him, not with defiance but something colder, detached. "They trusted the image of me, the steady hand, the smile. They never saw the truth in the ink. Trust is always the prettiest camouflage." His lips curved, not quite a smile, more like a crack in stone. Evidence teams swept through Eternal Ink in parallel, their gloves glistening under camera flashes. They found drawers filled with bottles, each labeled not with pigment codes but names. Some bottles were capped in black, others sealed with red tape, and each carried a tag written in Adrian's deliberate, slanted handwriting. The names matched clients scheduled for future appointments, dozens of them. One detective held up a vial, the glass catching the light, whispering under his breath, "Not yet used." On the tag was a woman's first name, the ink inside glimmering like coagulated blood. When confronted with the discovery, Adrian did not flinch. "Preparation," he said quietly, almost reverently. "You don't begin a masterpiece without sketching first. These bottles, they were sketches." His words unsettled the room, as if he had stripped the murders of horror and reframed them as craft. The minute whist came as technicians laid out the bottles across an evidence table, lining them by alphabetical order. Cameras recorded each label, the handwriting looping like veins on paper. Near the bottom of the stack, a single bottle bore a name that froze the room. It belonged not to a teenager or a young mother or an anonymous client, but to a man whose face was plastered across billboards and campaign posters. A city councilman, known for cutting ribbons and shaking hands, his speeches about progress echoing through the city square. His name, written in Adrian's careful red ink, gleamed under the sterile light. In the interrogation room, the revelation struck like a stone through glass. The lead detective dropped the photograph on the table, the councilman's face staring back from a campaign flyer. "Why him?" The question cut the silence. Adrian looked down at the paper, then back up, his eyes unreadable. "Ink remembers what people forget," he murmured. "Some names deserve to be preserved longer than others." He leaned back, the chain clinking softly, his calm unbroken even as the room swelled with dread. Outside the precinct, reporters shouted into microphones, their voices carried by the storm. "Tattoo killer arrested." Headlines blinked across screens, the phrase "Killer Inc." becoming a chant repeated in every newsroom. But inside, the tension deepened, because this was no longer just about anonymous victims. It had crossed into the realm of power, of politics, of public trust ripped open. Adrian sat unmoved as the hours dragged, his words repeated like a mantra. "It's done. Justice signed in ink." Yet in the evidence room the bottles waited, silent and sealed, each one a sentence deferred. The camera lingered on the list laid flat across the table, the ink still drying on some names. And there, among the dozens, one in particular burned brighter under the fluorescent hum, a name that could unravel more than trust in a tattooist. The final image of the night was not Adrian's calm face, but the camera gliding slowly across the handwritten list, stopping on the councilman's name circled in red. The ink shimmered like a wound that had not yet opened, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any confession. The trial began under white lights that seemed too clean for the grief they revealed. The courtroom was filled by 9 a.m., benches lined with families who clutched photographs, programs from funerals, fragments of lives that had been interrupted by ink that had promised permanence. When the prosecutor dimmed the lights and projected the first slide, the sobs began immediately. Across the screen appeared the tattoo of a phoenix stretching across the chest of Lewis, the wings still raw from ointment, the colors sharp against the pallor of death. His mother covered her face, her body shaking as if the image itself carried the poison back into her lungs. Another image followed, a shoulder covered with roses, captioned from a social post, "For my mother forever." This time it was Danielle's husband who stood abruptly, fists pressed against his temples as though the silence in the room was crushing him. The prosecutor allowed the images to linger longer than comfort permitted, forcing each juror to hold their gaze. Tattoos meant to be memory were now exhibits of death, permanence twisted into proof. At the witness stand, the prosecutor's voice cut the air with deliberate precision. He read aloud from Adrian's taped confession, his tone stripped of inflection so that the words struck cold and flat. "They fed on me, now I feed them back. Every tattoo is a death sentence signed in ink." The words reverberated through the chamber like a slow echo, sinking into walls, into wood, into breath. Members of the jury shifted in their seats, their faces pale. Adrian, seated across the room in his suit jacket, showed no reaction. His hands rested on the table, fingers still, eyes lowered to the grain of the wood as though studying the lines for hidden patterns. The defense rose with hesitation, their strategy fragile before it even began. They spoke of psychological strain, of divorce and debts, of a hand that trembled, of a man unraveling under humiliation and exclusion. Their words painted him as fractured, broken by circumstance, a victim of his own collapse. He was drowning, the defense attorney said softly. This was the desperate act of a man who lost himself. But the courtroom did not stir with sympathy. The families in the gallery shook their heads, whispers breaking through. The prosecution countered with a voice hard as steel. Drowning men do not prepare vials, do not mark names, do not calculate doses. This was not collapse. This was intent. The twist emerged when a survivor took the stand. A young man in his 20s, pale beneath the courtroom lights, rolled up his sleeve with hands that trembled slightly. Gasps rippled as he revealed his forearm. The tattoo was there, a dagger entwined with vines, but the ink was not crisp. It had blurred, spread outward beneath the skin in unnatural tendrils, black veins crawling toward the elbow like roots seeking soil. The man's voice wavered. It never healed. The doctors said the ink didn't stay on the surface. It moved. It's inside me. He paused, swallowing hard. I can still feel it like something alive. His words hung heavy, a living testimony that the poison had not always killed instantly but had lingered, feeding quietly in blood. The jurors could not look away. The prosecution pressed the moment further, holding up one of the seized vials before the jury, tilting it until the black surface caught the light. This is not art. This is not memory. This is murder disguised as permanence. The silence in the chamber deepened until even the shuffling of papers ceased. Closing arguments fell like final strokes. The defense spoke once more of strain, but the words cracked under the weight of evidence and the survivor's arms still visible, veins stained like a map of decay. The prosecution's last sentence rang through the chamber like a gavel before the gavel itself. He did not lose control. He built control out of poison and called it justice. At 5 p.m., the jury filed back into the room. Their faces betrayed nothing, but their verdict carried a finality that spread through the room like frost. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was read slowly. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words struck not only Adrian but the families, who exhaled as if holding their breath for months. Some wept, some bowed their heads, some clutched photographs tighter. Adrian himself barely moved. He sat with his hands folded, eyes on the table, as though the verdict was merely another line in a ledger he had already written. The court began to empty, footsteps echoing against marble, voices rising in relief and sorrow. Yet on the evidence table, under the cold light of the fixtures above, one object remained untouched. A tattoo needle gleaming faintly, its tip darkened by residue. Cameras lingered as it lay there, small, delicate, ordinary, yet transformed into an artifact of betrayal. The steel glimmered like an unspoken sentence, waiting, reminding, whispering to anyone who looked too long. And as the gavel struck, the chamber closed. The final image of the day was not the faces of jurors or the man condemned to die in a cell, but the needle itself, shining cold under the lights, a silent witness to justice that had come too late. The studio stood silent, its windows dark, its doors chained, the neon sign that once pulsed like a heartbeat now dead against the rain-streaked brick. At 7 a.m., city workers pasted bright warning posters across the facade, the glue dripping down like tears. In thick block letters, the message blared, "Ink kills." Pedestrians paused as they passed, some shaking their heads, others whispering to companions, none daring to look too long at the shuttered doorway. Eternal ink, once a sanctuary of permanence, was now a tomb sealed in plain sight. The warning spread beyond the block. At bus stops, on lampposts, across community bulletin boards, the same poster appeared, its black lettering echoing like a chant. Tattoo needles, once symbols of artistry, were now spoken of in the same breath as syringes filled with venom. Schools advised students not to book tattoos. Health clinics issued pamphlets describing symptoms of contamination. The language was clinical, but the fear beneath it was raw. By summer, the city's annual tattoo festival, once a gathering of color and pride that drew thousands, was canceled. The announcement came at 2 p.m. in the council hall, the mayor's voice shaking as he read the statement. For the safety of our citizens, this year's event will not proceed. Gasps filled the chamber. For decades, the festival had filled streets with the buzz of machines, the smell of ink and antiseptic mingling with food stalls and music. Now the empty calendar felt like a wound, the absence itself louder than the noise it replaced. Artists who once built their lives on trust now packed away portfolios, their machines gathering dust. A profession long seen as intimate had been recast as lethal. Inside the evidence vault, the objects remained, rows of black bottles sealed in plastic, their surfaces catching light like polished coffins. The vials once held dreams, names, prayers, memorials. Now they were archives of poison, tiny tombs in glass. Beside them lay the needles, tagged and numbered, their steel tips glinting cold under fluorescent light. No longer tools of creation, they resembled syringes of execution, each one a reminder that beauty could conceal death. Inspectors who cataloged them often turned away quickly, their notes clipped, their silence heavier than words. Families of victims lived with symbols carved not only on skin, but on memory. Some wore long sleeves even in heat, unwilling to see the images that had turned into epitaphs. Others traced the outlines with trembling fingers at night, whispering names of the lost as if the tattoos could answer back. One survivor, the young man with the blurred ink on his arm, became a reluctant messenger. His voice trembled on television as he rolled up his sleeve, showing veins still stained dark, the ink feeding through them like roots. "It doesn't fade," he said softly. "It's still inside." His words became a warning as much as a confession, replayed endlessly in news cycles, proof that survival was not freedom but sentence. The city itself carried scars. The block where Eternal Ink once stood became an unofficial memorial. Candles arranged at its steps, photographs taped to its walls, flowers left to wilt in rain. But as months passed, another mark appeared. Graffiti sprayed across the alleyway where Adrian once slipped into darkness. A bottle of ink was painted in stark black, tipped sideways, spilling out not pigment but a river of crimson that ran across the bricks. Below it, in jagged handwriting, the words bled into each other. "Trust bleeds." Children pointed at the mural when passing, tugging at their parents' coats, asking questions that were never fully answered. Teenagers took photos, their faces lit by streetlight as they whispered about curses, about names in notebooks, about bottles still hidden somewhere. Adults avoided the wall altogether, the graffiti too close to truth to be dismissed as art. The legacy was not in the courtroom verdict or the cell where Adrian spent his days. It was in the inversion that lived on in every corner of the city. Ink, once a promise of permanence, had become permanence of another kind. Distrust, fear, memory laced with poison. Bottles were coffins. Needles were syringes of betrayal. The art of marking skin had become the art of scarring a community. And as night fell, the mural glistened under the rain, the painted blood reflecting streetlights like a wound that would never close. The words beneath it seemed to pulse with each drop that struck the wall, as though alive, whispering the only truth that remained. Trust bleeds.